Who knew Xiaomi, one of the largest smartphone manufacturers in the world, made a gaming monitor? Today we're looking at the G Pro 27i, which sports a 27-inch flat IPS panel that runs a resolution of 1440p and a refresh rate that goes up to 180Hz. But better still, it has got a mini LED structure with a whopping 1,152 local dimming zones and display HDR1000 certification. But it gets even better, because at the time of filming and in the UK it can be found for just £300, while in the US it can be found for $370. A lot of monitors, given the overall specs of this monitor, will come in at double the price tag. Now in this review you can see if the specs are too good to be true and of course how it compares to some of its competitors. Speaking of which, I would also like to thank Philips Monitor for actually sponsoring this video. More on them a little bit later. Now to kick things off, I would just like to point out that if you do want to achieve the maximum refresh rate and resolution, you'll have to be connected up to one of the two DisplayPort 1.4 inputs. This is because if you opt for going for one of the two HDMI 2.0 ports instead, you'll be capped at 1440p at 144Hz. There's not a big deal of difference between the two refresh rate ranges, but just something I thought I should point out in case you're connecting this up to a laptop, which for example might only have an HDMI output. Now with that in mind, and with the monitor connected over DisplayPort to my desktop computer, which has an RTX 3080, I went ahead and did my tests. Now in terms of its overall input lag, I was left jaw-dropped. While playing a game such as Counter-Strike 2 or Valorant, I had no problems whatsoever when it came to registering my mouse inputs. It felt absolutely instantaneous, and here even a hardcore FPS shooters won't have any sort of issue while using this monitor. Now, it is also very important to talk about the response time, because it kind of goes hand in hand. And here it was similarly very good, which actually took me by surprise because a lot of mini LED IPS or other type of panel technologies will not be all that good. However, in this respect, this monitor just performed well across the board. Now, it's worth pointing out over here, you've got a few different response time settings that you can tune via the monitor's OSD. Standard, fast, faster and fastest. Now for those who are aware, you will know that as you go up the scale, for example towards the fastest mode preset, you'll get overshoot. In other words, you'll get this kind of purple trailing that will occur around certain objects when you're panning left and right. And the degree of severity of this very much depends on panel to panel. Now in this respect, the fastest mode preset pretty much had no overshoot that I could notice, all while responding the best that it could. So yes indeed, I was getting a best of both worlds. Now to demonstrate this and to give you some sort of objective numbers, I'm using the OS RTD tool. However, I would just like to give a disclaimer that the monitor did have quite a lot of brightness fluctuations, and therefore the OS RTD tool's numbers can't be taken by complete absolutes, and therefore I would take them with a grain of salt. Nonetheless, using the faster mode preset, I was able to clock in an average initial time of 5.28 milliseconds. This translates to the average G2G that most manufacturers claim. While that is actually pretty good, it gets even better on its fastest mode preset, with the average initial time dropping down to a stonkingly low 3.81 milliseconds and the percent in window going to 87%. Therefore, it's actually hitting quite a lot of the 180Hz refresh rate range. Now, as you'll be able to see over here as well, in terms of the UFO ghosting test, there is no inverse ghosting that you're able to notice, even on the fastest mode preset. So therefore, you're not getting any negative visual impairment while using the fastest mode preset, all while getting a very fast and responding monitor. Now, I would like to point out that unlike some of its competitors, this does not have any sort of MBR or motion blur reduction technology, and therefore you cannot get an even clearer image. With that said, here at 180Hz, I do think the motion clarity is actually pretty good. Sure enough, it's not going to compete with those monitors that have that MBR setting, or indeed higher refresh rate monitors, for example 240Hz or above, but still in the grander scheme of things, I think most people when it comes to motion tracking won't have any problems whatsoever. Now, other than that, I would also like to talk about adaptive sync technologies. Now, this monitor has got AMD FreeSync Premium certification and has got a VRR range that sits from 48Hz up to 180Hz. Now, in my case, I've got an RTX 3080, and while connected over DisplayPort, I had no problems running the Nvidia Pendulum demo. I didn't incur any sort of flickering or black screen issues, certain things that do actually affect some OLED monitors out there on the market. Now better still, I was able to run Nvidia G-Sync at 1440p at 180Hz with HDR, all simultaneously running in tandem while playing a game such as Destiny 2. Now this does actually bring me on to HDR, which in my opinion is one of its key fortes. Now the monitor has got a local dimming option, which you can enable or disable, and you've got 3 different options to enable it: low, medium and high, and this will affect the overall image quality that you get and also the brightness, which I'll touch upon further down in this video. Now it's great to see that local dimming can be used in both SDR and HDR, but really when it comes to HDR, it's where really it comes to life. And therefore, with local dimming enabled and HDR, I found to be that the experience was absolutely jaw-dropping. Now, given the monitor has got a very high peak brightness, it means it also features the HDR1000 certification by Display HDR. And as a result means that the overall image quality that you're getting is not only pretty accurate, but it also means that it does get pretty bright. And therefore, while utilizing this monitor with an HDR signal, I think a lot of people will be left absolutely jaw-dropped. And I do think it's one of its key selling points. Furthermore, in comparison to some of its competitors, which have less local dimming zones, the 1152 local dimming zones, thanks to its mini LED structure, really come to light. The only caveat, however, is despite the high number of local dimming zones, I still did notice the haloing effect. This is, for example, if you have a very dark scene and let's say a mouse cursor, or for example in certain game scenes or menus, you might notice a bit of the haloing effect. Is it something of a deal breaker? Absolutely not. And is it something that you're going to be able to notice while you're realistically using this monitor? Not in my opinion. But I'm sure there'll be certain use cases where some people might be able to notice that sort of haloing or blooming effect, and therefore it's just something I thought I should highlight in this video. Speaking about a phenomenal HDR experience, this perfectly brings me onto today's sponsor. The Philips Evnia 32M2N6800M is one of my favourite 4K gaming monitors. It sports a flat 31.5-inch Mini LED IPS panel that runs up to 144Hz. It has phenomenal HDR reproduction with Display HDR1000 certification, has support for adaptive sync technologies, is color accurate in the sRGB color space, has a sleek design, an ergonomic stand, and has even useful RGB lights in the form of Philips's Ambiglow technology, which helps achieve a better immersion. To find out more, click in the link in the description below or in the pinned comments to watch my detailed video. Now, shifting our attention back to the Xiaomi, I would like to talk about console gamers, and here I did actually put it through its paces. Now yet again, do take these figures via OSRTD tool with a grain of salt. However, I was able to test it on terms of its faster mode overdrive setting and achieved an average initial time of 3.95 milliseconds, which is very impressive, while on the fastest mode preset it gets down to 3.72 milliseconds. As for at 60Hz on the faster mode preset, it clocked in an average initial time of 4.26 milliseconds, and while on the fastest mode preset, just 4.15 milliseconds. In terms of the overall motion clarity and in terms of the inverse ghosting, well, yet again, it's actually all very impressive, very much like the same sort of assessments I had at 180Hz. Yet again over here, motion blur reduction technologies are not available. However, I will say that when it comes to using this monitor at both these refresh rate ranges, I did find it to be actually really usable. Now hopefully I've established that the gaming performance of this monitor is stonkingly good, but what about when it comes to its overall image quality? Well, as a reminder, you've got a flat IPS panel with a matte coating to it. It also has a resolution of 1440p and also a form factor of 27-inch, and therefore the overall pixel density, at least in my opinion, is perfect. Now 3D Monitors OSD, you've also got dedicated modes that you can choose. And using the sRGB mode, which I suspect will be the most popular, for example for image editors or video graders, you'll be able to see here that the gamut coverage was clocked in at 92.4% and a gamut volume of 95.3%. You can see below how it compares to the standard. As for the average delta, it sits at 2.52 with a maximum of 3.88, and therefore can be used for some light image editing work or indeed video grading. Its tested contrast ratio clocked in at 1122 to 1, which is acceptable for an IPS panel, and as for its measured white point in comparison to the 6504 Kelvin target, it came in at 5750 Kelvin at 100%, therefore showing it's a little bit off. Speaking of which, you'll be able to see the gamma curve just below, and yes, it is a little bit off in terms of how the gamma is being reproduced in terms of the sRGB color mode and while it is locked to the gamma 2.2 standards. Now, if you're not going to be doing any sort of image editing work, I would suggest going on the native preset or, for example, the DCI-P3 color mode. This will give you a little bit of extra pop and would unlock the wider color gamut of this monitor. Now, next up we should talk about brightness, and here in HDR with local dimming disabled, I noticed a peak of only 523 nits. I say only because while enabling local dimming, you can see it goes up to 870 nits, although it's a little bit below the display HDR1000 claim, so I'm not really sure how to achieve 1000 nits of peak brightness. Now, nonetheless, in SDR, it gets blindingly bright as well at 727 nits, while it also has got fantastic range going all the way down to 49 nits. In other words, this monitor can be used at roughly 40 to 50% brightness in a very bright room, while also being used in a completely pitch black environment at near 0% brightness. On that note, what about when it comes to the overall backlight bleeds? Well, here the monitor actually did perform pretty well. Now, it's worth pointing out that these images were taken with brightness set at 100% in a completely pitch black environment with local dimming disabled. As a reminder, local dimming can be used in both SDR and HDR. By contrast, however, if you were to enable local dimming, you'll get a completely pitch black image, which is exactly what you'd expect. Now, in terms of the overall brightness uniformity, this is where the monitor falls short a little bit, and therefore might be a cause for concern for certain video graders or image editors, because here the brightness is not uniform across the entire panel. At least it wasn't the case on my tested monitor. Now, before moving on from this section, I would like to talk about the brightness fluctuations that I noticed via the OSRTD tool. Now, here you'll be able to see some of the graphs with these kind of extreme highs and lows, and indeed in this respect it shouldn't be quite the case. It should be a little less severe and also a bit more of a smooth curved line, but unfortunately that wasn't the case. Now, the reason I'm highlighting this is because some people might have overly sensitive eyes and be susceptible to headaches. For example, with certain monitors out there that have this sort of high brightness fluctuations that are happening in the background, which is something that you might not be able to notice with your naked eye, however your brain is picking it up. Now, for someone like myself who's also a little bit sensitive, it didn't actually throw me off in the slightest, and while using this monitor on a day-to-day basis, I had no problems whatsoever to report. However, I did want to be as transparent and therefore give you all the information possible so that when it comes to purchasing this monitor, you're not making the wrong decision. Now, aside from all these tests, I would like to talk about the overall build quality of the monitor. And here it's got a 3-side bullets design with a relatively thin bottom bezel. There's also a small little power LED, which can be disabled via the monitor's OSD. Now, as for the stand, it's very sturdy, and it also has got a kind of boomerang shaped look to it. No complaints whatsoever, and it also provides you height, tilt, pivot and swivel adjustments, therefore giving you great sort of ergonomics. If for any reason you want to replace the built-in stand, you can do so via VESA compatible stand, allowing you to place it on a monitor arm or a multi-monitor setup. Now, the back of the monitor, you might have noticed a little RGB ring, and yes indeed there's these nonsensical lights at the back of the monitor which don't really serve a purpose. It's not like Philips' Ambiglow technology that gives you a degree of immersion. Nonetheless, you can customize the RGB behavior via the monitor's OSD, which can be accessed via a small little joystick button that's found at the back right hand side of the monitor. Now, the OSD itself is comprehensively laid out and provides you all the right sort of settings that you need to tinker around with it. And here it is also worth highlighting that the game mode doesn't have to be enabled for you to get the utmost gaming performance of the monitor, but rather is a game mode preset which you might want to utilize, for example, while jumping in certain games. Now, through the monitor's OSD, you might have clocked in a volume setting, but here the monitor does not have any sort of built-in speakers, but rather has got a 3.5mm audio output jack, and therefore means that you can plug in your headphones directly into the monitor if in case you do want to route audio directly through it. So with all that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict of the Xiaomi G Pro 27i, and yes, shout out to them to actually making a somewhat memorable name. Now, the monitor itself performs extraordinarily well across the board, which kind of leaves me baffled as to how good this monitor is. Let alone that, the price that it comes in at is absolutely ridiculous. It completely undercuts any of its rivals and gives you that same sort of level of performance that you might expect from a top tier gaming brand that a lot of people will know. Here, Xiaomi have really outdone themselves, and therefore means that this monitor is easily one of my favourites that I've reviewed, and as such gets my Best Buy award. Now I'd be curious to know what you make of it down in the comment section below, and how you feel it compares with some of its competitors. And of course, if you've enjoyed this detailed independent review, do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.